The Appalachian Triplet sisters are bad, and their sexual habits are disturbing. In 1879, one man crawled half-dead down from the mountains and whispered that through broken teeth. He said that 34 men, hunters and travelers, were trapped in a cellar under a cabin on Bone Ridge. They were all kept like animals for one terrible reason. The three sisters, who were always pregnant and always hunting, had turned people into breeding stock, and when the men were done with their jobs, they were sold one by one like cattle. But when Elias Thorne stumbled into the town of Hemlock's Vale, bleeding and desperate, things got even scarier. The sheriff, the preacher, and everyone else in town knew, but they chose not to say anything. For years, these women had been selling human flesh, while the whole community turned a blind eye. The sisters were not only monsters, they were also monsters that were safe. What kind of evil is so strong that good people have to protect it? Elias Thorne's mouth was full of mud and his own blood as he dragged himself through the thorny undergrowth. His fingernails were bloody crescents from clawing at roots and stones. The night without a moon was cruel. It was only the suffocating darkness that matched the horror he had fled. Every breath he took tasted like metal, and every movement sent new waves of pain through his broken body. The rough ground of the forest floor hurt his raw skin like 1,000 hungry mouths, but he kept going because he was desperate. The cabin on Bone Ridge and the three sisters who had made him less than human were behind him, somewhere in that endless black void. As he crawled, the memories hit him in waves that made him sick. The smell of the damp, sticky cellar where he had been locked up for 7 months. The stone walls were wet, and something much worse. The sadness of 34 broken men who had been living there for a long time. He could still see their faces in the suffocating darkness. They were gaunt, hollow-eyed creatures who had once been hunters, trappers, and travelers like him. Men who had answered the call of 3 beautiful women who promised to keep them safe from storms in the mountains, only to find themselves chained up in the dark, fed slop like animals, and used for things that made him sick to his stomach. Bridget, Morwen, and Saren. He could taste poison in their names. 3 identical people with raven black hair and skin that was as pale as the moon, moving through the cellar like ghosts of hell. Every night they would go down those wooden steps. Their bellies were always full of child, and their eyes were hungry. But not for food. They were hungry for harvest. The ritual was always the same: picking, taking, and doing it all quickly and efficiently. And then, the soft sound of their feet on the stairs, leaving behind another man, smaller, another soul cut away piece by piece. Elias had seen men leave the cellar and go up those stairs, never to come back. The sisters would talk in low voices about buyers, prices, and flesh that had served its purpose. He slowly began to understand how horrible it was, like frost forming on glass. They weren't just prisoners. They were breeding stock that their captors kept alive just long enough to help with their horrible business. And when they were no longer useful, they were sold to men whose faces Elias had only seen in the dark. He was lucky and desperate at the same time when he escaped. A rotting board in the cellar wall that had been weakened by years of mountain moisture and months of careful picking with a nail he had worked loose from his shackles. The hole got bigger every night until it was finally big enough for his thin body. He had squeezed through into the mountain's embrace, leaving behind 34 men who watched him go with eyes that held no reproach, only a terrible, resigned understanding. Now that he was dragging himself through the wilderness, every yard he gained felt like a victory taken from the jaws of hell itself. The thorns drew new blood, but it was his blood, which was shed in freedom instead of captivity. His hands found purchase on wet leaves, moss-covered stones, and anything else that would pull him away from that horrible place. The darkness felt like it was alive and pressing against him, but he had learned to find his way by the slope of the land and the sound of water running somewhere below. When dawn finally broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gray and amber, Elias was at the end of the world. The town of Hemlock's Vale lay below him in the valley, a group of old buildings that looked like they had been frozen in time, not affected by the progress that had happened in other parts of Appalachia. The sound of a church bell ringing in the morning air and the smell of smoke coming from chimneys in lazy spirals were normal sounds of normal life that seemed impossibly far away from the nightmare he had lived through. He finally lost his strength as he stumbled down the last hill. The world tilted, and for a moment it looked like a kaleidoscope of earth and sky. Then darkness took him again. He woke up to find himself lying on clean sheets in a small room that smelled like lavender and wood. A woman with kind eyes and gray hair that was too early for her age was putting a cool cloth on his forehead. Her touch was as gentle as a mother's. "Easy now," she said in a voice that sounded like it came from the mountains. "You're safe. My name is Elizabeth Fry. My husband is the preacher here in Hemlock's Vale." Her eyes were full of compassion, but there was also something else there, a flicker of recognition, as if she had been waiting for someone like him for a long time. Elias told the story in fits and starts, each detail pulled from the depths of his trauma like pieces of glass from a cut. He talked about the cabin, the cellar, and the 34 men who were still stuck in that hell of stone and shadow. He talked about the sisters in a way that made Elizabeth's face turn pale and her hands shake as she worked on his wounds. The words came in a flood, the breeding, the selling, and the horror of it all. The next day, Sheriff Abernathy came. He was a middle-aged man with a soft belly and eyes that showed the tired patience of someone who had seen too much of the darker side of human nature. He listened to Elias's story with a look of polite interest, nodding or making small sounds of sympathy from time to time. Elias thought it was strange how he acted, like he was far away and careful not to take sides. "Well now, that's quite a story you've told, son," the sheriff said when Elias was done. His voice had the calm tone of someone in charge. "Quite a story indeed." He scratched his chin and thought about it, but his eyes never quite met Elias's. "Of course, you've been through a lot out there in the woods. Head injuries can mess with a man's memory and make him see things that aren't really there. But the men," Elias said, his voice breaking with desperation. Abernathy stood up and adjusted his gun belt. "Oh, I'll look into it," he said. "As soon as you're better from your time in the woods, we'll take care of everything. Just relax now and let Mrs. Fry take care of you. The law is here, and everything will be fine." Elias felt a small seed of hope grow in his chest as the sheriff's footsteps faded away on the wooden walkway outside. The law was present. Civilization had rules, protections, and ways to deal with monsters. He would get better, and then justice would come. The 34 men would be let go. The sisters would have to deal with the consequences of their actions, and the nightmare would finally be over. Elias Thorne let himself believe in salvation for the first time in months, but sleep took him again. 3 days later, Sheriff Abernathy came back, and Elias's fragile hope began to crack. His heavy footsteps on the wooden porch of the Fry home made it clear that he was not happy. But he didn't walk with any urgency, as if he were a man who had seen terrible things and was getting ready to make things right. Instead, he moved like someone who was bored with a boring task, with the same calm look on his face that had made Elias uneasy when they first met. "Well now, Mr. Thorne," the sheriff said as he settled his large body into the chair next to Elias's bed with a tired sigh. "I went up to that ridge country you talked about and looked around really well. I spent most of 2 days combing through those woods." He stopped and took out a small notebook from his vest pocket, flipping through its pages with great care. "Listen, son, there isn't a cabin up there where you said it would be. There isn't even a cellar. It's just trees and rocks, and the kind of rough land that can mess with a man's mind." The words hit Elias like blows to the body, taking his breath away with every syllable. "But it's there," he said in a voice that was barely audible over the sudden roar in his ears. "The cabin on Bone Ridge has a stone foundation and a cellar underneath with iron rings set into the walls. The men are still there, Sheriff. 34 of them chained up like animals." Abernathy's face didn't change. His eyes had the calm, patient look of an adult who was humoring a child's fantasy. "Now, I understand you've been through a powerful ordeal out there in the wilderness. Head injuries are tricky things, Mr. Thorne. They can make a man see all sorts of things that ain't really there, remember events that never happened. It's more common than you might think." He closed the notebook with a soft snap that sounded like the closing of a coffin lid. I think you fell badly on some rocks up there and knocked yourself out for a while. The mind tries to make sense of lost time by filling in the gaps with whatever it can think of. Elias said, I didn't fall, his voice getting stronger even as his hope faded. I got away. I crawled through a hole in the cellar wall that I worked on for months. The sisters, Morwen, Bridget, and Saren, kept us to breed, then sold us when we were no longer useful. The sheriff's face hardened almost imperceptibly, so much so that someone who wasn't as desperate might have missed it. Mr. Thorne, I'm going to give you some free advice. This county has its share of stories, old tales that get passed down and twisted until they bear no resemblance to truth. Mountain people have always been superstitious. But spreading wild accusations about well-known members of the community? That's the kind of talk that can get a man into serious trouble. Abernathy had already gotten up and was walking to the door before Elias could say anything. His message was as clear as a judge's gavel. The hope that had kept Elias going through his darkest times faded away, leaving a void that quickly filled with a cold, creeping fear. 2 days later, when Elias was standing on the front porch of the Fry home, testing his still shaky legs, he realized how bad his situation really was. The sun in the morning made long shadows on the dusty main street of Hemlock's Vale. The town was waking up to the calm rhythm of life in the country. While their mothers hung laundry on lines between porches, kids played in doorways, men stood outside the general store, talking and smoking tobacco at the same time. Elias almost thought he could lose himself in the normalcy of the scene because it was so peaceful. After that, he saw her. Bridget came out of the general store with the smooth grace of a predator. Her black hair caught the light like a raven's wing, and her belly curved outward under her simple dress. The sight of her always pregnant belly sent ice through Elias's veins. She walked through the crowd with an unsettling amount of confidence, nodding to shopkeepers and chatting with townspeople like any other pregnant woman running errands in town. But the answers she got told a different story. When she walked by, conversation stopped, and nervous smiles and averted eyes took their place. Mothers called their kids inside quietly, saying they had important things to do right away. There was an unspoken tension in the air, as if her presence had cast a shadow over the whole street. Bridget saw Elias across the dusty street and smiled, which made his blood run cold. It wasn't the smile of recognition or surprise. It was something much more terrifying. The smile of ownership, like a hunter who had found her escaped prey exactly where she thought he would be. The look on his face showed no anger or worry. Instead, it was a calm, predatory satisfaction that made it seem like his flight had been nothing more than a fun distraction. They stared at each other across the street for a long time, while the town's morning activity went on around them like actors in a play that neither of them was watching. Bridget's smile grew bigger, showing teeth that looked too white in the morning light. She then walked toward him slowly, as if she had all the time in the world. Elias stumbled back, almost falling over, and ran into Elizabeth Fry, who had been standing next to him. Her face was as pale as new snow, and her eyes were wide with fear, which told Elias everything he needed to know about the truth of his story. She knew. God help them all. She knew. "Inside," she whispered urgently, her fingers digging into his arm with surprising strength. "Come inside now, before." But she couldn't finish because she was pulling him through the door and slamming it shut behind them with hands that shook like leaves in the fall. Elizabeth leaned against the door in the safety of her house, as if her small frame could somehow keep the evil that roamed freely through the streets of Hemlock's Vale from getting in. "You can't talk about this," she said, in a voice that was barely audible. "Not to anyone. Ever. For your own good, Mr. Thorne. And for all of us. Ting." "But you know," Elias said, his voice heavy with understanding. "You know I'm being honest." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears, but she wouldn't let them fall. "Here, knowing and speaking are two different things. Some truths are too dangerous to say, and too powerful to question. The sisters' reach goes far beyond Bone Ridge. They have protections you can't even imagine." When Preacher Fry got back from his rounds that night, he listened to Elias's pleas again. with the patience of a man who was used to hearing people confess their sins, both real and imagined. But when Elias was done, the preacher's answer was the last word on the matter. "Mr. Thorne, what you say is a sinful delusion, a corruption of the mind that tries to put down godly women who serve this community as healers and midwives. I suggest you pray for forgiveness and stop talking about such evil." That night, when darkness fell over Hemlock's Vale, Elias Thorne finally understood what his prison really was. The town was not a safe place to hide from the bad things on Bone Ridge. It was a part of it, woven into the very fabric of the sisters' power. Everyone in this place was involved in some way, whether it was out of fear, greed, or just not wanting to see the truth. There was no one to help the 34 men rotting in that stone cellar but him, and he was completely alone. He was now the only one fighting for their lives, and the price would be more than he could ever have imagined. Elias didn't retreat into the wilderness out of fear. He did it because he had finally realized how strong his enemy was. If Hemlock's Vale was too far gone to be saved, and the sisters' influence had poisoned the very foundations of law and order, then he would have to change into something else. Not the civilized cartographer who used to make maps for the railroad companies. He was no longer the man who thought institutions were powerful and people were good. Now the mountains would be on his side, and being alone would be his safe place. He left the Fry home before dawn, on a morning when the valley was covered in autumn mist that looked like the breath of ghosts. He took nothing but the clothes on his back and a small bag of supplies that Elizabeth had quietly packed for him. They had both agreed on the decision, even if they didn't say so. His staying there put her family in danger, and her not being able to help him openly would only make him more angry. But as he disappeared into the trees above the town, Elias took with him something more valuable than food: the knowledge that at least one person in Hemlock's Vale knew the truth about what was going on Bone Ridge. The high ridges that looked down on the sisters' land became his new home. They were a network of stone outcroppings and hidden caves that gave him great views, while keeping him hidden from those below. Elias began to rebuild himself here, among the rocks that had been shaped by the wind and the short pines that had somehow learned to grow in soil that was too thin. His body was still healing from months of being held captive, and his desperate escape, it slowly got stronger as he had to survive in the mountains. But more importantly, his mind, which had once been a precise, methodical tool for measuring distances and heights with scientific accuracy, was now focused on mapping something much more complicated and much more dangerous. He became obsessed with the sisters' daily lives and wrote down every detail of their movements on pieces of bark and scraps of cloth using charcoal from his small fires. Morwen, the oldest and most calculating, didn't leave the cabin much during the day, but when she did, it was always for a reason. She would spend hours in the woods, coming back with bundles of herbs and roots that she carried in a leather bag that had been worn smooth by years of use. She moved through the wild in a way that was too quiet, as if she had learned how to walk without making even the leaves on the ground below her feet move. Bridget was the hunter among them, and watching her stalk through the forest was like seeing a predator that had changed in ways that ordinary nature couldn't explain. She moved with such grace that it seemed to break the laws of physics. She appeared and disappeared among the trees, like smoke taking shape. Elias saw her kill a full-grown deer with just a knife. She was so quiet and quick that the deer didn't know it was going to die until her blade hit its throat. But what bothered me more than her unnatural skill was the look on her face when she killed someone. It wasn't the grimace of someone doing something they had to do. It was the calm satisfaction of an artist perfecting her craft. Saren, the youngest sister who never spoke, was still the most mysterious of the three. She didn't go far from the cabin very often. Instead, she spent her days taking care of a small garden that seemed to do well in the bad mountain soil. But her silence didn't mean she wasn't talking to anyone. It was something much more unsettling, a hole that seemed to pull sound and meaning into itself. Elias could feel the weight of that silence even from far away, as if her presence made the forest sounds quieter. During the full moon of his third week in the mountains, he made the most terrifying discovery. As midnight drew near, the sisters left their cabin and moved in perfect sync toward a clearing that Elias had not seen before. They did rituals there that he couldn't understand because they were surrounded by stones arranged in ways that hurt his eyes to look at directly. They moved without saying a word. Their big bellies stood out in the moonlight, and they moved in a way that looked like it had been carved into their souls long ago. The forest itself seemed to react to their presence. The usual night sounds stopped, as if even the animals that are active at night knew something was wrong. But when the buyer showed up, Elias's growing understanding changed from fear to something like tactical knowledge. The man came in a wagon pulled by horses that were covered in mud and looked as bad as their driver. He always arrived in the darkest hours before dawn, when even the most dedicated insomniac would be fast asleep. He was a huge guy, with shoulders that could fill doorways and hands that could crush a man's skull like an eggshell. But Elias's blood didn't run cold because of his size. He did his business with a casual efficiency that was like how a farmer might load up animals to take to market. One night, storm clouds gathered over the mountains like an army of the damned, their bellies full of lightning and thunder. This broke the solitude of his vigil. Elias was hiding in a shallow cave, huddled around a small fire that he had carefully hidden from view. He heard the soft sound of footsteps on wet stone. His hand instinctively reached for the knife he had made out of a piece of metal he had found, but the voice that came from the dark was one he knew. "Mr. Thorne?" Elizabeth Fry stepped into the flickering circle of firelight. Her face was thin and tired, and there was something deeper in her eyes. The haunted look of someone who had been fighting with her own conscience and losing. She had a small basket with cloth on it, and a tin lantern that she had kept carefully closed while she climbed. "I brought you some food, and something else you need to see." As the storm raged above, she whispered her confession in short bursts, each one worse than the last. She had been the town's unofficial record keeper for 15 years, helping other women deal with the problems of giving birth and losing babies that seemed to happen too often in Hemlock's Vale. But the pattern was too clear to ignore. Stillborn babies whose bodies disappeared before they could be buried. Healthy newborns who just disappeared during the night, all after the sisters had been there as the Hollow's midwives. "They take them," Elizabeth said quietly, her voice barely audible over the thunder that rolled across the ridges. "The living ones, when they're small enough, weak enough." "And the others?" She shuddered and couldn't finish her thought. "I've had my suspicions for years, but I was too scared to say anything because I was worried about my own family's safety." The journal she gave him was bound in cracked leather that felt old and rough under his fingers. The pages were yellowed and damp from age. She said it had belonged to her brother, who had died 10 years ago, in a way that the town thought was an accident, but that had always bothered her. The writing was neat at first, but it got more and more sloppy as the dates went on. It was about a growing obsession with what he called the Ridge Witches and their evil deal with the town's founders. But it was the secret drawing that was hidden between the last pages of the journal that made Elias's heart race with what might have been hope. There was a rough but detailed map of the cabin and its surroundings, drawn in fading ink with notes in a different hand. And there, clearly shown by a series of careful measurements, was a second entrance to the cellar. It was a root cellar access point that connected to the main chamber through a narrow tunnel that the sisters had either forgotten about or chosen to ignore. Elias Thorne felt something stir in him for the first time since he escaped that was more than just survival. He had a friend, even though she was weak and scared. He had information that he had gathered over the course of weeks of careful watching. And now, most importantly, he had a weapon that was not made of steel or gunpowder, but of knowledge that was as sharp and deadly as any blade ever made. People would always remember the 34 men in that stone hell. Justice would get to Bone Ridge, even if he had to make the way himself. The plan came together after a number of secret meetings in the high country. Each time Elias and Elizabeth met, they were in constant danger of being found out, but they were also driven by a shared desperation that had grown too strong for rational fear. They met in the ruins of an old hunting cabin, where the roof had long since fallen in and the walls were made of rotting wood and rusted nails. It was a place that the living had forgotten about, but it was perfect for them. By the light of carefully shielded candles, they built what felt like their first and last chance to show the world the horror that had taken root in the mountains. Elizabeth's knowledge of herbs that grow in the mountains turned out to be their best weapon. She learned about the plants that grew wild in the Appalachian soil, by helping with births and deaths for many years. She whispered about foxfire fungus, a strange organism that glowed with an eerie green light when it was prepared the right way. People who knew how to look for it could see it even in complete darkness. The fungus could be ground into a paste that would stick to wood and metal. This would make a glowing trail that would be hard to see during the day, but easy to see at night. "The buyer comes every 6th week," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind that moaned through the cabin's broken walls. "Always on the night of the new moon, when the darkness is thickest. He follows the same route down from the ridge, past Miller's Creek, then along the old logging road that connects to the main thoroughfare. If we could mark his wagon with the paste, create a trail that an honest lawman could follow." Her words trailed off, but the implication hung in the air between them, like a prayer offered to an indifferent God. The plan was beautiful, because it was so simple and used the sisters' own arrogance against them. They had been able to do whatever they wanted for so long because the town didn't speak up and Sheriff Abernathy was corrupt. They had become careless about threats from outside. In 3 weeks, a circuit judge was going to drive through the county on the main roads with a small group of federal marshals. These marshals would be sworn to look into any signs of federal crimes. Moving kidnapped men across state lines would definitely count, and the glowing trail would be clear proof of the route taken by the buyers. Elias threw himself into getting ready with the same focused intensity as a man who had found meaning in the depths of despair. He looked at the route the buyer would take and remembered every twist and turn of the mountain roads. He found the best place to set up their ambush. It would have to be along the narrow stretch where Miller's Creek ran parallel to the path, where the sound of rushing water would cover up any noise they made, and the rocky ground would give them plenty of places to hide and get away quickly. Following Elizabeth's careful directions, the group of fungus hunters went deep into the forest to find fallen logs and rotting stumps where the foxfire grew in delicate, see-through patches that seemed to pulse with their own light. They worked by moonlight to scrape the fungus off the wood it was growing on with wooden tools that Elias had made just for that purpose. They put the fungus in clay pots that Elizabeth had stolen from her kitchen. The work was hard and dangerous because they had to go into the area where the sisters hunted. But when they saw the strange green glow coming from their prepared paste, the risk seemed worth it. But hope, Elias discovered, was a dangerous emotion that clouded judgment and bred carelessness. The fact that they might succeed gave them the courage to be bold when they should have been quiet and scared when they should have been. They started to meet more often, stay longer in their conversations, and speak in voices that carried just a little too far in the mountain air. The change in their behavior was small, but very important. They had lived in fear for so long that the thought of fighting back made them drunk with rage. Morwen could feel the change in the hollow's mood, like a shark smelling blood in the dark water. For months, the fear that came from Hemlock's Vale had been steady and predictable, like a steady stream of terror that she could read as easily as other women could read the weather. But now, the fear felt different, like it had changed in some way that suggested secrets were being shared and plans were being made. She hadn't lived this long by ignoring these kinds of warnings, and her animal instincts told her that betrayal was coming like a storm on the horizon. The night of their planned ambush came with the kind of clear light that mountain people called a hunter's moon, even though the sky was too full of stars to see the moon. Elias and Elizabeth got to Miller's Creek well before midnight. They had their prepared paste in small containers that could be quickly put on the wagon's wheels and undercarriage. The sound of the water rushing over the rocks was perfect for their quiet conversations while they waited. Their hearts were racing with fear and excitement, which made the hours go by like wounded animals. Elias felt a rush of savage satisfaction when the wagon finally showed up on the mountain road. Its iron-shod wheels ground against the stone, and its driver hunched over like a gargoyle on the seat. They had been planning for this moment for weeks, with careful planning and desperate hope. But when he got up from his hiding place among the rocks with a brush full of paste in his hand, the wagon stopped. The silence that came after was so deep that it seemed to suck the air out of the mountain hollow. Morwen's voice then cut through the darkness like a knife through glass, cold, sharp, and terrifyingly sure of itself. Some debts must be paid with blood. The ambush that came next was quick and brutal. It was a planned attack that showed they knew their victims very well. The buyer moved very quickly for a man of his size. His huge hands wrapped around Elias's throat before he could even scream for help. But it was Bridget who emerged from the forest shadows like a nightmare-given form, her pregnant belly incongruous against the predatory grace with which she stalked toward their hiding place. Elizabeth tried to distract Bridget by throwing her container of foxfire paste at her feet and yelling for Elias to run. But her bravery only made things worse. Morwen seemed to come out of nowhere, appearing behind her as if she had come out of the dark. One pale hand covered Elizabeth's mouth, and the other pressed something sharp against her throat. There was no need for words to say, "Give up," or "watch her die." Elias broke free from the buyer's grip, out of desperation, not strength. The giant's hands were left with skin and blood as he rolled away into the creek bed. The cold water woke him up completely, and he scrambled up the other bank while Elizabeth's muffled screams followed him into the woods. He ran without thinking, branches tearing at his clothes and rocks cutting his feet. He was driven by a cowardice that burned in his chest like acid. He watched them pull Elizabeth toward the cabin from the safety of the tree line. Her small body didn't matter between Morwen's strong grip and Bridget's predatory stride. The door opened like a mouth swallowing light, and she was gone, leaving behind only the sound of her death and the heavy weight of his failure. The hope they had shared was not only gone, it was completely gone. It was so gone that it felt like a physical wound. And now he was in charge of not only the 34 men who were rotting in that stone cellar, but also the only person who was brave enough to stand with him against the darkness. He would carry the guilt of her capture with him into whatever hell awaited them all. The days after Elizabeth's capture were like a fever dream of sadness and self-blame. Each hour felt like an eternity of pain that threatened to drive Elias insane. He moved through the forest like a ghost, shuffling around like a man whose soul had been cut out of his body with a dull blade. Sleep didn't help. All I could hear were Elizabeth's muffled screams and see her being dragged into that cursed cabin over and over again. Food turned to ash in his mouth. The water tasted like copper and regret, and even breathing felt like betraying the woman whose bravery was much greater than his own. He was in this state of cataleptic paralysis for almost a week, neither fully alive nor fully dead, like a ghost haunting the scene of his own moral failure. He learned that grief was like a fire that could either destroy or cleanse. In the depths of his sadness, a new kind of flame began to burn. It wasn't the bright hope that had kept him going during his first days of freedom, nor the desperate optimism that had made him plan pointless escapes and impossible rescues. This was something colder and more lasting. The steady, unending burn of a man who had accepted that blood was the only way to buy redemption. The change didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly as the person's resolve grew stronger and centered on one unbreakable promise. Elizabeth's death would not be in vain. He would either see the 34 men rotting in that stone cellar again or die trying. But more than that, he would do whatever it took to bring the truth about what was going on Bone Ridge to light. Justice was no longer something he wanted to do. It was something he had to do. It was written into the very fabric of his being, with letters of fire, and sealed with the blood of innocence. Elias found the key to his last move while reading his brother's journal by the flickering light of a pine torch. There was a passage buried among the growing number of frantic entries about ridge witches and unholy compacts that made his blood run cold. It talked about how Hemlock's Vale was founded. The journal says that the original settlers sealed their deal with the sisters by changing the course of Black Creek so that the water flowed through a series of carved channels that formed a protective pattern around their new community. They had given the creek as a gift to powers they couldn't understand or control. Elias knew from his years as a surveyor that water could create and destroy, and that what men had changed could be changed again. There was a natural reservoir above the sisters' cabin, fed by underground springs that had been running since the mountains were young. It was held back by a dam made of rock and fallen trees that had built up over many seasons. It wouldn't take much to break down that wall. All it would take is moving some key stones around, taking out some supporting timbers, and having a man who knew how flowing water and falling rock worked do the work slowly. It took him almost 2 weeks to finish the work. He worked in the dark before dawn, when the sisters were least likely to leave their cabin. using tools he made from scrap metal and his own desperate creativity. He cut new channels into the rock face above the dam. These were narrow grooves that would direct the eventual flood straight to the cabin and the hidden graveyard that his trained eye had spotted in the strange shapes of the ground around it. The sisters didn't care about how they buried the dead, which left behind small mounds and dips that told a lot to someone who knew how to read the language of disturbed earth. Elias had learned from closely watching the town get ready that the circuit judge was supposed to pass through the main road on the morning of October 15th. Judge Cornelius Whitmore was known throughout the territory as a man who couldn't be bribed. He was always with federal marshals who didn't have to answer to any local authority. Sheriff Abernathy's lack of authority would not matter if evidence of federal crimes could be put right in front of him. Elias Thorne stood above the weakened dam on the morning of the 14th and began to systematically destroy the barriers that held back the mountain's accumulated fury. The mountains were painted in gold and crimson as dawn broke. He took apart decades of work, piece by piece, until only a few key supports were left. Then he waited, counting the hours until the judge's carriage would be right below him. His heart was steady, like a man who had moved past fear and hope and into something like religious certainty. At exactly 9 a.m., the last stone fell, and the mountain responded with a voice that sounded like thunder. The water didn't come like the biblical flood he had imagined. Instead, it came as something more focused and precise, a torrent of mud, stone, and debris that carved a new scar down the side of the mountain with surgical precision. It hit the cabin hard enough to move the whole thing on its foundation, and then it kept going toward the hidden cemetery where the sisters had buried their sins. The earth didn't want to give up its secrets, but it did. The pale evidence of horrible crimes was scattered across the newly carved channel as the floodwaters receded, leaving behind a landscape that was unrecognizable. There were so many small bones that they looked like scattered pearls in the morning sun. The bodies of babies and kids, some so small they could fit in one hand, and others so big that they looked like they had lived for years of unimaginable pain. Judge Whitmore acted quickly and decisively. Within hours, federal marshals were climbing the mountain with grim determination, and their authority was more important than anything else. They found the cabin damaged but still standing, and the people inside were trapped like the predators they had always been. The sisters were taken without a fight. Their pregnant bellies were very visible even when they were in chains. Their faces were blank with shock, as if they had never thought their reign could end. The marshals broke down the secret door that Elias had marked on his rough map, and the cellar revealed its own horrors. 34 men came out, blinking in the light of day. Their bodies were thin and broken, but their spirits still held on to the hope that had kept them going through months of unimaginable suffering. Some cried. Some people laughed like they were really crazy. But they all had the same unmistakable signs of what they had been through. Men with hollow eyes who had seen the worst of human evil and somehow lived. The sisters' trial was a big deal in the area, and people came from as far away as Richmond and Atlanta to see it. But Elias Thorne did not enjoy the show. Instead, he felt bitter because he knew that when justice finally came, it would not be clean or victorious. Hemlock's veil fell apart when the truth about its involvement came out. The people of the town scattered like leaves in a cold wind as the full extent of the town's silence became clear. Elias left the Appalachian Mountains for good after the last of the legal proceedings were over and the sisters went to prison. He took with him the few things he had gathered. He was no longer the man of reason and science who had first climbed those peaks. He was no longer the cartographer who thought that careful observation and exact measurement were powerful tools. The mountains had taught him things that no surveyor's tools could measure: how bad people can be and how hard it is to tell the truth about things that make you uncomfortable. He always remembered Elizabeth, which was both a heavy and sacred burden. He also knew that justice was not a destination, but a journey that changed everyone who took it. He had learned that the search for truth was not a noble goal, but a necessary reckoning that left scars on everyone who dared to see the world as it really is.